Thank you, Lasky and Corla. And Minister, this is a really important amendment. It's focused on removing the functional test of mental capacity as a means of determining whether a relevant person can exercise their legal capacity. This approach results in substitute decision-making rather than supported decision-making. The functional test of mental capacity has been found to be contrary to the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. The UN Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities states in General Comment 1, and I quote, "The functional approach attempts to assess mental capacity and deny legal capacity accordingly. Article 12 does not permit such discriminatory denial of legal capacity, but rather requires that support be provided in the exercise of legal capacity." End quote. The retention of the functional test and substitute decision-making means that the Act is not compliant with the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. At committee stage, Minister, you refused to accept this amendment because you said that the functional approach to mental capacity is compliant with Article 12 of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities and General Comment 1. You were incorrect, and I hope in the meantime you and your officials have consulted those documents. As I've just quoted, General Comment number 1 clearly states that functional assessment of capacity should not be used to deny someone's human rights and recognises it is an unreliable method of assessing the inner workings of the human mind. It discriminates on the basis of disability and has been recognised as a subjective method of assessment, with individuals receiving different results depending on the person conducting the assessment. In the Children's Committee pre-legislative scrutiny, we recommended that the functional test of capacity should be removed and replaced with an obligation to acknowledge, interpret and act upon the relevant person's will and preference in line with the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. I'm trying to be proactive here, and I've put forward an amendment based on the guidance from the Centre for Disability Law and Policy, who are undeniably the experts in this area. The wording is drawn primarily from a draft statutory framework for legal capacity law reform in Canada. Another reason you seem to be opposed to the amendment was due to the subsequent changes that it would trigger. If these changes are necessary to ensure that the Act is compliant with the Convention, then they must be adopted. Related to this was the excuse that these changes would delay the progress of the bill and prolong the abolition of wardship. Since the timeline has shifted and seems to now be a moving thing since committee stage, and the Minister is now proposing transitional arrangements to continue wardship, there's obviously fresh scope to make the necessary amendments. It's far preferable that these amendments take place now to ensure Ireland is as close as possible to compliance with our international obligations. These issues will arise during the review and when Ireland enters into dialogue with the UN Committee in Geneva. This will also be raised. We have the opportunity and we have the responsibility to ensure the Act is compliant with the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. Minister.
Thank you, Corla. This amendment seeks to replace Section 3 of the 2015 Act, which sets out the functional capacity model with replacement text on legal capacity. As drafted, the amendment does not fit with the overall architecture of the 2015 Act or the amendment bill. It would require significant policy drafting to give effect to the proposed amendment, as the functional model is core to what the previous administration tried to achieve with the 2015 Act and what we're trying to achieve with the amendment bill. And that fundamental restructure would make the current bill unworkable, and it would prolong the abolition of wardship, something we all wish to achieve. The amendment seems to be, and as I said at committee stage, it does seem to be designed towards a view that the functional model isn't compliant with UNCRPD. I don't accept that position. The government doesn't accept that position. And I don't accept that the 2015 Act or the Amendment Act as a whole don't provide compliance with Article 12 of the Convention. I want to be very clear. The 2015 Act and the Amendment Bill provide a framework for supported decision-making that will provide the components for legal certainty and for compliance with Article 12. While no single section sets this out, the 2015 Act provides for relevant persons to hold and exercise legal rights, responsibilities and duties. and where higher tier decision supporters may be the people exercising these rights, interests and duties, they are required to do so in a manner that aligns explicitly with the will and preference of the relevant person, and a robust and proportionate oversight regime will be in place to ensure that that's how the Act is operated. Where we aren't compliant with the UNCRPD is our continuous reliance on wardship. The place of functional capacity model in the Act is designed to maximise a person's decision-making capacity in a manner that explicitly privileges and provides a framework to enforce and safeguard their explicit will and preference. And in contrary to the prevailing system of wardship, assisted decision-making will allow a person to hold and exercise legal rights and obligations. So while I appreciate the intent again of this amendment, I don't think this model, which would, as I say, fundamentally remove a central element of what we're trying to achieve here, I don't think it's helpful in terms of achieving Ireland's overall compliance with the UNCRPD. And again, and I've spoken on the guiding principles contained in Part 2 of the original Act on a number of occasions. Guiding Principles 8.2, it shall be presumed that a relevant person who falls within paragraph A of the definition of relevant person has the capacity in respect of the matter concerned, unless the contrary is shown in accordance with the provisions of this Act. So the very centre of the legislation that we are seeking to activate here through this amendment legislation is that presumption of capacity. And in terms of General Comment 1, I suppose I'd make the point that you're right in your direct quote. It comes from 2014. It was written prior to our current legislation even being drafted. But what I suppose I draw attention to is what's currently being said by UN bodies about the Irish legislation, and just draw the House's attention to Ioannis Rouskas. He's the Vice Chair of the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And he stated earlier this month at the World Congress on Adult Capacity in Edinburgh, he commended Ireland and commended the progressive nature of our legislation, and he praised the introduction of mechanisms by Ireland for supported decision making. So that's not me saying it, that's not the government saying it, that is the Vice Chair of the UN Commission, the UN Committee that oversees the UNCRPD and is responsible for the state, for drafting the state reports on each member state, and recognising the advanced nature of the legislation that we have here. But legislation, let's not forget, that is still not enacted. And that's why this bill is important, and that's why the functional test needs to be an element of this bill, and that's why I'm not able to accept this amendment.
Minister, when you say that you don't accept that position, I hope you're aware that you're basically saying you don't accept the position of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. This issue is very clear. There's no ambiguity. Retaining the functional test makes the Act not compliant with the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And at the risk of repeating ourselves, I'm going to, because I think it's important this goes in the record, to quote the UN Committee's General Comment 1 at paragraph 15. The functional approach attempts to assess mental capacity and deny legal capacity accordingly. It is often based on whether a person can understand the nature and consequences of a decision, and or whether he or she can use or weigh the relevant information. This approach is flawed for two key reasons. A, it is discriminatorily applied to people with disabilities, and B, it presumes to be able to accurately assess the inner workings of the human mind, and when the person does not pass the assessment, it then denies him or her a core human right, the right to equal recognition before the law. In all of those approaches, a person's disability and or decision-making skills are taken as legitimate grounds for denying his or her legal capacity and lowering his or her status as a person before the law. Article 12 does not permit such discriminatory denial of legal capacity, but rather requires that support be provided in the exercise of legal capacity. As the UN Committee has made clear, the functional test of mental capacity has no place in a true system of supported decision-making, And then you say, what is a breach of the UN CRPD is the wardship. Yes, 100%. I think everybody agrees with you there. But so why are you introducing amendments to extend that? And you're speaking about the Vice Chair of the UN Commission. I would bet money on it now that if the Vice Chair of the UN Commission saw Amendment 5, they would support it.
Thank you. I regret Deputy Kearns' attempts to put words in my mouth, so let me be very clear on what I'm saying. I do not believe that the 2015 Act is in breach of the UN CRPD, and that's my position, and that's the position of the government. The piece that you quoted was written a year prior to the 2015 Act being drafted, and as I've stated, the body that oversees the UN CRPD, the Vice Chair of that body, has complemented our approach to the issue of dealing with capacity. And the reason that what Ireland is seeking to bring in, the reason that that is being recognised and that has been regarded is because of the graduated model of tiered decision-making supports that we're introducing. And you spoke of supports and you quoted the issue of supports. We're bringing in those supports in terms of the tiered decision-making within the 2015 Act, and we will activate them if we initiate this. Also, the fact that the language in the Act is disability neutral, and importantly, we've moved away from that idea. There's no diagnostic component linking incapacity to a condition. We're moving away from that. We're moving away from that model that was adopted in wardship. And it also, the Act moves us away from a best interests approach, and again centres on the will and preference of the individual concerned. That's what this legislation seeks to achieve. That's what is at its core, and that's why members of the UN CRPD committee are recognising the advances that the Irish legislation represents.
Amendment 5. Is the amendment being pressed?
Moved and pressed.
The amendment's been pressed. Is the amendment agreed? Not agreed. So na teachtaí atá ar sonda ceiste abrigí tá.
Tá.
Na teachtaí atá na gcuine abrigí níl.
Neil.
Is dótha go bhfuil búte ar an gceiste.
Vote all.
Vóta. Result. Tá 5 yes 55, níl 71, no 71. Sílam go bhfuil búte ar an gceiste. Agus Bogomid Jurai Anish. The time permitted for this debate having expired, I am required to put the following question in accordance with an order of the Dáil of the 28th of June that the amendments set down by the Minister for Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth and not disposed of are hereby made to the bill. Fourth stage is hereby completed and the bill is hereby passed. Is that agreed? Agreed. Not agreed. Not agreed. And the teachtaí atá ar sonda ceiste abrigí tá. The teachtaí atá na gcuine abrigí níl.
Neil.
Is dótha go bhfuil an ceist rite. So the bill will now be sent to the Seanad.